canals and so on, corridors cutting through, which leave unviable cantons. Probably they're aiming for about 50% of the West Bank, that's what it looks like. That would include what's called Area C, where there's total Israeli control, no Palestinian control. That's about 60% of the West Bank. A third of it has already been turned into closed military zones, which are the standard device for preventing Palestinian development or building. 40% of the settlements in Area C are on private land, Palestinian land. Palestinian construction is prohibited in 70% of Area C, and more than 90% of Palestinian permits are rejected. That's the option that's being pursued and will be pursued, not one state. Notice that there won't be any demographic problem. Demographic problem's the technical phrase for too many non-Jews in a Jewish state. There won't be any demographic problem. Very few Palestinians will be incorporated within the regions that Israel will take over, and no civil rights struggle. That's the alternative to two-state settlement. It's common to draw analogies with South Africa. They're mostly irrelevant. They're unfair to South Africa. So take the Bantustans in South Africa. The Bantustans were strongly supported by the South African racist government. That was their labor force. That was, 85% of the population. That's what they relied on for labor. So they had to develop the Bantustans, just keep the labor force functioning. Also, they were trying very hard to get international recognition for the Bantustans. It failed, except for one state. Israel recognized them, had trade missions, military aid. They didn't get official recognition from anyone else. But in order to try to get it, they had to kind of prettify the Bantustans. There's nothing like that in the West Bank. Israel has no interest at all in the Palestinians. What Ovadia Yosef said is basically the attitude. And sometimes it's made clear, like Moshe Dayan again, who was in charge of the territories after 67, and among the Israeli leadership, was probably the one most sympathetic to Palestinians. He informed his colleagues in 1967, after the war, that we should tell the Palestinian refugees that we have nothing to offer them. They can live like dogs, and if they want to leave, they can leave. And we'll see where that leads. Meanwhile, we'll establish permanent rule, he said, but no responsibility. So no civil rights struggle. Actually, there's one analogy to South Africa that is relevant and crucial. In 1958, the nationalist regime, the apartheid regime, recognized that they're becoming internationally isolated. And we know from declassified documents that the South African foreign minister called in the American ambassador, and we have the record. Basically, he told the ambassador, we're becoming an international pariah. We're being voted down in the United Nations on just about everything. But he said it really doesn't matter because there's only one vote in the United Nations, that's you. And as long as you support us, it makes no difference what the rest of the world's doing, which is pretty realistic. And that's pretty much the way it worked out. And by the 1970s, there were international sanctions. By the 1980s, even congressional sanctions against South Africa. But the Reagan administration continued to support the South African regime. It was part of what was called the War on Terror. Remember that Bush redeclared the War on Terror. Reagan declared it. And in order to, the African National Congress was declared to be one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. That was 1988. And in that context, Reagan continued to support the apartheid regime. Trade increased. The U.S. supported them while they were carrying out, apart from what was happening in South Africa, horrifying attacks in Angola and Mozambique, probably killing over 1 million people. But Nelson Mandela was regarded as a leading terrorist. In fact, he just got off the terrorist list about 2 years ago. And now, for the first time, he can come to the United States without official waiving restrictions. Well, by around 1990, things began to change. Two things. One, which is quite crucial but unmentionable, is that Cuba drove the South Africans out of illegally occupied Namibia. That was quite important. Cuba also, they sent black soldiers, and they drove the South Africans out of Angola. That was not only important, but also Equatorial Guinea. It was important, but it was also psychologically important. It broke the myth of white invincibility. It paralyzed black Africa and had strongly supported the white racists. But here the South African army was being defeated by black soldiers coming from Cuba. That had a major effect on the liberation of Africa. And even more amazing, Cuba never took any credit for it. They wanted the black African nationalists to be able to take the credit for it. That's an act of international solidarity, the kind I've never heard of before. It's essentially unknown except to specialists who read the scholarship on the topic. It was exposed a couple of years ago by a very good American scholar here at Legesis, and you can find the details in his publications, book and others. But that had a huge effect. The other event that took place was that the United States shifted its policy. We don't have internal records, so we can only guess. But it looks as if the American business community and the South African business community decided that they'd be better off if they ended apartheid, but kept the social and economic relations steady. So you have a couple of black faces in the limousines, but otherwise it stays pretty much the same, not the only such case. Well, when these two events took place, apartheid ended a couple of years later. It's a real victory for justice, but quite partial. If you follow the recent miners' strike and the brutal state reaction, vividly illustrates it. That's not the only case. There are other cases like it. Time's late, I won't run through them. But it is conceivable that the U.S. might shift policy as it's done in other cases, just on pragmatic grounds. And Europe could again be influential if Europeans are willing to stand up for peace and justice instead of just kowtowing to the boss across the seas. And if that doesn't happen, the prospects look quite grim. Stop there.
Thank you very much so far. He has promised to answer questions and to participate in the debate, and I call upon Kurt to lead that debate. Please,
Okay, thanks very much, Noam, for stimulating the provocative lecture. We want to take some time for questions. It's extremely important to use microphones during questions. So we have a system of people who are going to run around with microphones to take the questions. It's also important that you remember that this is a question period and not a period for a second talk. So I know that there are lots of people who stimulated by this talk who would like to make comments or ask questions, so that's fine. I know that there are some high school students here from in town, and I'd especially like to try and get some of them in, but let's just get started. Please let me know if you would like to ask a question or make a comment. It's a Norwegian crowd